James Marchant's early years show the kindness and influence that he had on many lives, especially that of a very young Liza. Written and narrated by Marion Jasper. James was born in March 1790 in Belfast to Frederick and Maud Marchant. Several children had been born to the couple, but James was the only one to survive. He was loved by his parents, although they found it difficult to show their true feelings to him because they were steeling themselves in case they lost yet another child. He was not unhappy, but he did become an adult before most of those his age. On the death of James's grandfather, his father took over the family's storage and carting business, and it became very lucrative at that time. They moved into his grandmother's home, which was convenient, as she was old and seemed to become older since the death of his grandfather. They met up with many others at church each Sunday, and one of those families was the Fuller family. They had a son, Wendell, who was 3 years younger than James, and quite often they would share Sunday lunch together. James was very kindly towards young Wendell, and when Wendell's mother was having another child, Maud Marchant took the little boy in to stay for the duration. Sadly, the child died, and shortly after, the mother also passed away. From that time onwards, Wendell spent a great deal of time in the Marchant household, and James looked upon him like a younger brother. Wendell's father owned a small shipping company, and often transported Frederick Marchant's goods to England, as well as to other parts of Ireland. They therefore developed a close business relationship. James was well accepted at university, and was still there when Wendell joined him 3 years later. By that time, James was so well respected that nobody dared to treat Wendell poorly, as many younger students were put upon as standard practice. On many occasions they could be found together discussing their families' businesses, and they decided that in the fullness of time they would purchase a couple of barges and begin their own company, and eventually they did exactly that. By the time James was 21 years old, he was contemplating marriage, although he had not decided on a particular lady. There was a group of 3 young ladies who attended the same church. All were pretty and would be very acceptable within his family. He tentatively made inquiries concerning them, and found that one was already engaged to be married, and another had an understanding with a young gentleman. That left a very pleasant young lady called Martha, and James made it known that he was interested in her. Her family were delighted, as the Marchants were a very respectable family, and their business was thriving, as was James's and Wendell's small barge enterprise. Wendell had his heart set on a very pretty young girl, whose family lived close by, but she was still too young to be considered eligible for marriage. Her name was Amelia, and Wendell let it be known that there was nobody else for him, and he was quite willing to wait until her parents felt that the time was right for them to marry. Life was very pleasant for the Marchant family, until one day James's father suffered a serious heart attack and had to retire from his business. James had been working with him for a number of years, so he naturally took over the reins of the company, and he quietly made improvements which also increased the profitability of the undertaking. He then decided that the time had come for him to marry, whilst his father was able to see that he was settled, and he knew that Martha would make sure that his mother was well cared for in the future. Wendell was James's best man, and Martha's 2 friends were her bridesmaids. A week after the wedding, James's father died. He had been in his early 50s, and it was not considered a very old age. Naturally, James inherited the house and the business, and Martha was happy to care for Maud Marchant. Wendell and James often discussed business, and James found this very helpful as his business was growing by the day. Finally, Wendell married the love of his life, Amelia, and she moved into the Fuller family home. She was someone who everyone loved, She always had a friendly smile for everybody, and it could be seen that she and Wendell were made for one another. In 1818, Martha gave birth to a boy, and they named him Frederick, after James's father. Once Martha was over the birth, she spent all her time with her son, leaving James's mother to run the household. "My mother is not getting any younger," James said to Martha. "We really should be looking after her rather than the other way around. She enjoys being useful, and besides, I have Frederick to look after. He takes up most of my time," said Martha. There were times when she asked how the business was faring, and she seemed genuinely interested, and often made one or two useful suggestions. Martha did show James some affection, but gradually their love life ground to a halt, and James sighed and concentrated totally on work. There were many occasions when he spent time with Wendell and Amelia, and he enjoyed the warmth of their household, which was sadly lacking in his own. Amelia gave birth to a little girl in 1820. She survived for around 6 weeks, and both Wendell and Amelia were devastated by their loss. Martha did come to the fore at that time, and did her best to comfort Amelia. 1820 was also the year that Wendell's father died, and he naturally inherited the shipping company, which was running well, but not yet as profitable as it was to later become. Over the course of the following months, James became very thoughtful. He could often be found in his study at home, poring over lists of figures. Finally, one day he made his way down to the Belfast docks, where Wendell had his company offices. Wendell was delighted to see him, but he was always very astute, and asked what was on James's mind, as he obviously had something to tell him. "You're right, Wendell," said James. "I have been doing a great deal of thinking recently, and I hope you won't take offence, but I believe that we should amalgamate our businesses and eventually expand into other allied markets." "That's a wonderful idea, James," said Wendell, "but your company is more lucrative than mine is at present. So really what you are suggesting is a takeover." No, I'm not, Wendell," said James. "I think that we could have an equal partnership, because you have the ships and I have the goods. That's putting it in the simplest of terms, and I know that there would be a great deal to iron out, but it could work in principle." "That could be very unfair on you, James, because our companies are not equal," said Wendell. "Mine is building nicely, but it has not reached what yours is worth." "I know, but with my input it could get there much more quickly, and if we are equal partners, whatever I put in which is over and above your investment will be owed to me by the company, plus interest. I'm sure with what you have planned for your expansion would mean raising a loan from a financial house. So would it not be better for me to invest rather than be beholden to a bank?" said James. "Well, it would mean that the company will grow in strength, and we can work out quite easily what would be owing to you, James," said Wendell. "There is very little that you don't know about shipping, and it would be exciting to expand that side and start shipping across the Atlantic," said James. "That is a very lucrative area to move into, but I would need 2 much bigger ships," said Wendell thoughtfully, and he smiled. "No doubt you've already done your sums on that." "Well, yes, I have made a few inquiries on prices of ships and the crew needed for them," said James. "And of course you know the type of goods needed in various areas. We need some bigger warehouses. There are some available here, but you know that, don't you?" smiled Wendell. "So you think that the suggestion has some merit," said James. "Yes, James, and I believe that we would work well together. There is a great deal to sort out, but nothing that is insurmountable. I think that we will become a force to be reckoned with," said Wendell. "There are many areas that we could eventually expand into," said James, "one of them being inns and hotels. After all, travellers and seamen need somewhere to lay their heads occasionally, but that is well into the future." Marchant and Fuller was born that day. James had suggested that it could be Fuller and Marchant, but Wendell felt that Marchant and Fuller ran off the tongue much more easily, so that was what it became. Within 3 years, Marchant and Fuller had expanded, and during that time all loans that James had made to the company had been paid back. They had also taken over larger premises at the dockside, and James just kept the warehouses at his old premises. Regular sailings were made to New York, which were indeed very lucrative. Wendell worked out of one large office, as did James from another. Also, Wendell became a father to a very healthy son, who they named Edward. James was his godfather and Martha his godmother. Life and business was becoming very pleasant for the two families. Wendell and Amelia had two further boys, Peter and Joseph. They would have liked to have a girl, but they loved their family, and Amelia had a very relaxed way of bringing up her boys. Their house was always full of noise and laughter, and although James sometimes found it overpowering, he envied their life. Martha often showed a disapproving face when visiting, but that seemed to add to the fun of the family. Frederick joined in the merriment on many occasions, and he ignored his mother's pursed lips and enjoyed the gatherings. When Frederick was around 10 years old, his grandmother Maud passed away peacefully in her sleep. Martha now had to take over the household responsibilities, so she employed a relatively young housekeeper, Mrs. Edwards. There was already a cook, Mrs. Brown, and gardener, Mr. Grouch, but the housekeeper meant that Martha could continue to spend most of her time taking care of Frederick. James's life was now more devoted to business, and when necessary, Martha was an excellent hostess, and she impressed many business associates, always managing to say the right thing at the right time. James became used to the situation. Martha made sure that his house was well run, and she never did anything that could embarrass him. His son was being brought up correctly, although he realized that he was being spoilt by his mother. As time went on, James took a mistress. She was a very warm and friendly lady, who gave him everything that was lacking in his marriage. She asked nothing in return, but James set her up in a nice home and visited her frequently. Marchant & Fuller was expanding rapidly. They now had 4 ships that sailed to New York, and sometimes on to other parts of America. James went on one of the trips with the intention of finding a reliable manager for their American operation. He was introduced to a young man who did appear to be down on his luck. It was not James's business to ask why that should be, especially as he was impressed by the man's knowledge of shipping and storage. "Have you worked in our industry before, Mr. Mahoney?" asked James. "Yes, sir," said Henry Mahoney. "I was employed by the Kempston Company since leaving school, but I'm afraid I lost that position for personal reasons. I would add that my employment was not terminated for any dishonest reason, although I know you will find that difficult to believe. You were recommended to me, Mr. Mahoney, so I believe that you are an honest person. Would you mind telling me why Kempstons felt it necessary to terminate your employment?" asked James. "My wife is the only daughter of the Kempstons, and her family did not approve of our association," said Henry. "I decided that I should do the right thing and not associate with Myra, but she was having none of that, and she ran away from home and came to me. Her parents were mortified, but insisted on our marriage for the sake of her reputation. However, they disowned her, and we have been struggling ever since. We both turn our hand to whatever brings in money for food, and we just about manage to keep a roof over our heads. This job would mean so much to us both, but I understand if you think that by employing me would jeopardize whatever association you may have with Kempstons. I want the best man for the job, Mr. Mahoney, and I am not concerned with personal difficulties. Any such difficulties are between you and them," said James. They discussed terms, and James welcomed Henry Mahoney to the company. "Tell me, Henry, where are you living at present?" asked James. "Myra and I have a room fairly nearby, so it would be convenient for me working here," said Henry. "I understand that life has not been treating you well recently, and I do not wish to insult you, but at present the top floor of these premises is surplus to our requirements. It is already set out as living accommodation, and perhaps you may like to utilize it for your wife and yourself, until, of course, you are in a position to be able to move to somewhere more respectable," said James. Henry looked down and remained silent for a short while before saying, "It is not an insult, sir. It is a prayer answered. I would be delighted to accept your offer on behalf of my wife and myself." James laughed. "Perhaps you should see what is being offered before accepting. Your wife may not like it." "There is no doubt that she will like it, Mr. Marchant," said Henry quietly. "Well then, I suggest that you break the good news to your wife and spend the rest of the day getting settled," said James. "I am off to inspect a property, as I feel that it would be useful to have somewhere for members of both my family and the Fullers to stay when in New York." "Are you looking at the large one on the hill?" asked Henry, and James said that it was his intention. "It is rather overpriced, and I understand it does need some renovation. I had heard that they would be hoping to sell to someone from England who does not know the true value of properties," smiled Henry. "Thank you for the warning, Henry, but I know what I am prepared to pay for it, and it is certainly not what they are asking for it," said James. "So, Henry, I will see you bright and early tomorrow morning," and he handed the keys of the building to Henry and asked if he had very much to move in with. "We have very little, but we will make do with what we have for now," smiled Henry. "There is some furniture already in place, but as you know, if it is not suitable, we do have enough space to store what you do not need," smiled James. Henry knew that James was leaving him with some dignity, as he and Myra had virtually no furniture, even to the extent that they were sleeping on blankets on the floor. Henry hoped that there may be a bed in the premises, and he also hoped that it was clean enough for them to sleep on. James took a cab up to where the house was that he was showing interest in, and Henry decided to go to Myra so that they could view the premises together. He knew that she would be excited, and he wanted them to both enjoy the moment of their first step on the ladder to success. Myra had given up so much for him, and he felt tears of relief welling up in him. At last he had something to offer her, although he realized that it was really James Marchant who had come to their rescue. The house on the hill was exactly what James was looking for, but it did need renovating. Although the rooms were large, they appeared very dark and dingy. James laughed at the price that was being asked, and he made a fair offer, which was immediately accepted. He smiled and thought that perhaps he should have offered less. He was going to be in New York for at least a month, so he could oversee most of the work. With terms agreed and contracts signed, James made his way back to the dockside and bumped into Henry and a very excited Myra. With introductions over, he asked if the accommodation was to their liking, which was when Myra burst into tears. But he could see that they were tears of joy, and Henry looked suitably embarrassed. James smiled and told them that he had better not hold them up, as he knew that they had a great deal to accomplish in a short while. Whilst Myra revelled in her new home, Henry set about hiring suitable workers. "I must get some suitable staff for the house," commented James to Henry one day. "If you would like some assistance with that, I know that Myra has had experience in employing house staff. Naturally, the final decision would be yours, but she could whittle them down to just a few for you to interview," said Henry. "That would be very useful. Would it be an intrusion if I were to ask her to make some suggestions concerning the kitchen? It is rather dilapidated, and it is not an area that I have ever concerned myself with. My wife would naturally understand what would be needed, but she will not be here for some while yet," said James. "Would she not prefer to discuss it with you?" asked Henry. "I'm sure that Myra would be able to arrange it all to our satisfaction." "Of course, I don't wish to impose on her too much," said James. "She would love to help with that. It will be some time before we will be able to organise our own house, so I know that it will give her an aim, and you will appreciate that she has been used to the finer things in life," said Henry. "She will have them again, Henry," smiled James. "She will eventually, I hope, but I doubt that she will ever be accepted back into the social circles that she once enjoyed," said Henry. James looked thoughtfully at Henry and commented that as far as he could see, Myra was quite happy the way she was, and that certain social circles were not all they were cracked up to be. Henry was a very efficient manager, and Myra was in her element, arranging whatever was needed at James's house. James was very confident that he could leave all in their very capable hands, and he made arrangements to leave New York the following week. He had already been there 2 weeks longer than he had anticipated, but that was because he was enjoying his stay. He received a letter one day from Mr. Evan Kempston, requesting a meeting. "Have you been in touch with your father-in-law, Henry?" asked James. "No, he would not give me the time of day, and would pass me by if we were in the same street," said Henry. "Why?" "He has requested that I have a meeting with him," said James. "I just thought that you might know what it could be about." "He probably wants you to sack me," said Henry unhappily. "I have told you, Henry, that whatever problems you have with Myra's family are your problems alone, and have nothing to do with Marchant and Fuller, and I shall tell him such." "The Kempstons are a very powerful family, and their company is also a force to be reckoned with," said Henry quietly. "Well, Henry, you may think that they are powerful, but they are not so powerful that they can dictate who I employ or who my friends are. They may have some influence here in New York, but I have influence in many other places worldwide. So don't worry, Henry, your job is quite safe. You may rest assured that you and Myra are quite settled now," said James. "They do have influence." "I don't think that you realize just how much they do have," said Henry. "Henry, you know that I have had many meetings whilst I have been here, and most of those meetings were with the American government. I have managed to obtain lucrative contracts, which mean that you will be working so hard that you won't have time to worry about the Kempstons. You no longer have to think about where your next meal is coming from, and soon I am sure that you and Myra will be able to move into a house that is more suited to your standing," said James. Henry smiled, and said that he wished he could be a fly on the wall if James had a meeting with Evan Kempston. "Well, Henry, I will not be going to his home or business premises, but I will invite him here if he is so keen to meet me," said James. "These offices are much better than the Kempston ones," mumbled Henry. Mr. Kempston declined the invitation to visit James at his offices. James just shrugged and told Henry not to be intimidated by his father-in-law, especially when James had left for England. The redecoration of the house was well underway, and James took pleasure in moving into the main bedroom for his last few days in New York. He now had a housekeeper, a chef, and a young maid called Bridget, whose Irish accent was so strong that James rarely knew what she was talking about. Myra invited James to dinner in their apartment 2 days before he was due to leave New York. She had gone to a great deal of trouble and probably had spent more than she could afford to entertain him well. He appreciated her efforts and realized that she was going to be a wonderful asset to not only Henry but also to the company. Over dinner he reiterated once again that Marchant and Fuller was now a very large company and that they were not to be intimidated by anyone. In about 3 months' time Wendell would be due to visit New York, and Myra said that she would make sure that the house was ready for his visit. Myra and Henry waved James off 2 days later on his long journey back to Belfast. He did hope that Martha would visit New York in the not-too-distant future, but he was not hopeful. Over the course of the next few years, James and Wendell visited New York on several occasions. They stayed at the main house, and Myra was very good at organising small gatherings, although there were times when some women refused to be associated with her. Both Wendell and James were well aware of how she was sometimes ostracised, but they chose to ignore it. It must, however, have been very hurtful to Myra and Henry. Martha and Amelia never visited New York. Frederick was old enough to be either left or he could have joined them on what he would have considered an adventure, but Martha was not keen to leave Frederick behind or deal with a child on board ship. Amelia was busy with her 3 boys, but she did say that she would like to travel to New York, and she hoped that she would soon be able to, but her boys were a handful, although Peter was showing a very serious side to his nature. Business both sides of the Atlantic was booming, and Henry and Myra were no longer intimidated by the Kempstons, and eventually they managed to buy a pleasant house very near to Henry's office. They had both appreciated being able to live in the apartment, and it had given them the opportunity to get on their feet, But now they were going to have a place of their own, and it was a house to be proud of. Sadly, Martha died when Frederick was just 16 years old. She had found it difficult to breathe on several occasions, and one day she just could not catch her breath, and she died, much to everyone's shock. Frederick was devastated, as he had relied on his mother too much, although he was attending university at the time. Time passed, and eventually James decided that some of Martha's belongings should be sorted out and taken to the church to be distributed to the needy, and the time to do it was when Frederick was away at university. There were some books and dressing-table items that he felt should go to Sheila Donoghue, who had been a friend of Martha's and a bridesmaid at their wedding, and he would take them on his next visit to Liverpool, where she now lived. "I think I would like to go with you to Liverpool, James," said Wendell. "You might need some moral support in our negotiations over the purchase of the hotel and inn." "That would be good, Wendell, and I could do with your company," smiled James. "I will only be visiting the Donoghues for an hour or two. I'm sure you'll be able to amuse yourself for that time." Sheila Donoghue was delighted to see James, and sorry that it was under such circumstances. She was touched that James had thought of her, and she asked him to call again when he was next in Liverpool. Over the following few years, James did visit the Donoghues on occasion, although Liza was never around when he was there. But then he called one day when Liza was sitting in the front garden, reading. Her parents were not at home, and as she looked up, James seemed to be startled. "You must be young Liza." "I'm James Marchant, and I'm very pleased to meet you," said James. "And are you, sir?" said Liza, and she offered him refreshments, but he declined and said that he would call again another time. He did ask her what she was reading, and seemed impressed by the fact that her book was in French. More time passed, and once again James was in Liverpool. They had set up some larger offices at the docks, and James was negotiating with one of his customers, who commented that he believed that James knew the Donoghue family. "I do. Why do you ask?" said James. "They are attempting to sell their daughter to the highest bidder," the man said with a slight smile. James looked at him in horror. "How do you know this?" asked James. "Because my son seemed to be on their list of eligible suitors, but that is not the way that marriage should be handled. I don't believe that the girl knows what is being suggested, and of course it will not do her reputation any good," said the man. "I don't know why I felt that you should know this, but it seemed important that I told you." When the client had left, James immediately made his way to the Donoghue household. Liza and her companion Kate were in town shopping. They both kept wondering why certain people were staring at them. "It must be because we are so good-looking," laughed Kate. Back at the Donoghue household, James banged loudly at their door, and when he was shown into the sitting room, Liza's parents were taken aback by the ferocity of James's words. Mrs. Walsh, Betty and Mr. Ridgway could hear the loud argument taking place in the sitting room. They had heard the rumours of what the Donoghues were planning for Liza, and they were pleased that at least someone was trying to help her. They had found it difficult to believe that Liza's parents could be so mercenary, and they had not mentioned it to either Liza or Kate, but the situation was now being confirmed by the visitor. They heard the front door slam closed, and the house fell silent. Nobody in the kitchen knew what to say, but a few minutes later they were aware that the front door was banged open again, and they heard James Marchant laying down the law to the Donoghues. And after a while the discussions calmed down, and finally they heard James Marchant leave. Kate and Liza arrived home, and none of the staff mentioned the argument between the Donoghues and James Marchant. The next day James left for Belfast, and with hindsight he realised that he had not spoken to Liza, who was now his fiancée. He wondered how Frederick was going to take the news. For a short while he had contemplated attempting to marry Liza off to his son, but he knew that it would not be a match made in heaven, and he realised that Liza needed someone who would encourage her rather than stifle her intelligence. He could not bear the thought that she would spend the rest of her life chained to someone who would make her unhappy. He knew that it was going to be a shock to her, but even though it was not a love match, he felt fond enough of her to allow her the freedom to pursue her dreams. James arrived in Belfast late in the day. Frederick was still at university, so he decided to visit Wendell and Amelia, who were always pleased to see him. Directly he was shown into their drawing room, they both realised that something unsettling had happened. "Did your trip go well, James?" asked Wendell tentatively. "Yes, the hotel and inn are now ours, and the new offices are comfortable," said James, who then fell silent. "What is it, James? What has happened?" said Amelia. "We can see that you have something to tell us." "I shall be getting married in the summer," said James, and waited to hear what Wendell and Amelia had to say. "You don't seem very happy about it, James," commented Amelia. "Who is she?" "Well, it isn't something that I set out to do. A set of circumstances led me to this," said James thoughtfully. "She is the Donohue's daughter, Liza." Wendell looked carefully at James. "I thought that she was very young." "She's not in trouble, is she, James?" "Good heavens, no," said James. "She is such an innocent child." He then proceeded to tell them how it all had come about, and at the end of his explanation, both Wendell and Amelia were incensed by how appallingly young Liza was being treated by her parents. "But she is not your responsibility, James. You can't get people out of difficult situations, no matter how disgusting their treatment is," said Wendell. "How old is she?" asked Amelia. "She won't be 17 until May, which is why I have arranged that the wedding takes place after that time," said James. "What does Liza have to say about it?" asked Wendell. "I don't know. I didn't see her on this visit," said James. "What do you mean you didn't see her on this visit?" demanded Amelia. "Surely you saw her when you proposed?" James looked suitably embarrassed. "She wasn't home when I called to tell her parents what I thought of them offering her to the highest bidder. I told her parents that I would be pleased to marry her, and if they wanted a highest bidder, then I was that person. James, in all the years that I have known you, you have never acted on the spur of the moment. You have always weighed up a situation before acting upon it," said Wendell. Amelia was smiling. "Well, James, you must have strong feelings for the girl, because you have acted totally out of character, and I can't see you being that kindly towards someone that you thought nothing of. It would have been a good idea to let her know what you were planning, though. I wonder how she is going to react when she is told that you are to be her husband. She might refuse. I think that you had better return to Liverpool shortly and go and woo your fiancé," said Wendell. "Of course, you haven't had the chance to tell Frederick yet. I wonder how he is going to take the news. She's 2 years younger than he is. It is going to be a very big shock for him," said Amelia. James had wondered at the wisdom of his proposition many times on his journey back to Belfast, but whenever that thought came to him, a face also came into his mind, and he knew that he couldn't leave young Liza in the unscrupulous hands of her parents, and the more he thought about it, the more he began to realise that Amelia was right. He did feel a great deal for young Liza. James made plans to return to Liverpool the following week. Frederick was due home from university just before James's trip, and it was not a meeting that James was looking forward to. Frederick would have no right to question his decision, but having been very close to his mother, he would think that his father was being very disloyal. For the very first time, James experienced the wrath of Frederick, and realised that his son was determined to dislike young Liza. "She is nothing but a money-grabber, father, and I'm surprised that you fell for such an unscrupulous manipulator," shouted Frederick. "It is obvious that you don't want me around, so I shall have to leave home. What would Mother have said about this marriage?" "Your mother would have said nothing about this, as the situation would not have arisen if she had still been alive," said James. "But it is happening, and you will have to make the best of it. Liza has not had a particularly happy childhood, and I will not have you making her life even worse than it has been in the past." "Has she told you a sob story? Once again I'm surprised you have fallen for this. I think that I will move in with Uncle Wendell and Aunt Amelia until you come to your senses," hissed Frederick. "You will do no such thing. This is your home, and it will remain so. You are nearing the end of your studies, and the time has come for you to join me in the business. You have a lot to learn, so you'll be starting work at the end of June. You will eventually be inheriting my half of the business, so you had better start learning what you can sooner rather than later. As far as my marriage to Liza is concerned, you have said enough on the subject, and I want to hear no more, said James. I hope that I can trust you to at least smile on my wedding day. Frederick grunted and stormed up to his room. James finalised his arrangements for his trip to Liverpool. His disagreement with Frederick had unsettled him, but he still felt that he was doing the right thing. He had never been so confident of anything before in his life. James immediately made his way to the Donohue's house, once his ship had docked in Liverpool. Sheila made a valiant attempt to be pleased to see him, but she was on edge, as she did not know what to expect from him. I left last week without seeing Liza. That was most discourteous of me. As you know, I was incensed by what you had planned for her, and it was unforgivable of me to leave without at least making my intentions known to her, said James curtly. She is in the garden, reading as usual. Just give me a minute to get my cloak, and I will take you to her and chaperone her, said Sheila. I think that the need for a chaperone has long passed, and what I have to say to her is for her ears alone, snapped James. Oh, was Sheila's only comment, and she directed him to the garden, and he could see Liza sitting in a well-kept section. He slowly approached and hoped that he would not surprise her too much, but she looked up as he came near, and although she was not smiling, she did not look unfriendly. He walked up to her and looked down as she held his gaze. Please sit, Mr. Marchant, she said quietly. I believe that you may have something to tell me. I have, Liza. And firstly, I want to apologise for leaving so abruptly last week, without even the courtesy of talking to you and making you aware of my proposition for you, said James. I know that my parents had made it obvious that they had had enough of me and wished to find someone to take me off their hands, said Liza sadly. I believe there were several unsuitable families that they had approached, and I could not bear the thought of you being married off to someone who would make you unhappy for the rest of your life, said James. Do you think that you could be the person to make me happy then, Mr. Marchant? Asked Liza. Yes, I do, Liza. I know that there is a vast difference in our ages, but I will not make too many demands on you, and I will also encourage you to continue in whatever you wish to pursue. I know that eventually we will make a good marriage. I know that you will make me an excellent wife, and I will be a very caring husband, said James. I do not know how to be an excellent wife. I have not been instructed in such matters, said Liza quietly. James took Liza's hand and said, You have no need to worry about such things, Liza. As we get to know one another better, all such problems will be solved. Liza looked up at him and held his gaze for a long while, and James had the feeling that she was reading his mind. I know you will be kind, Mr. Marchant, and I must be honest with you. It is not a situation that I had in mind for my future, but I believe that in time we will rub along nicely together. I will do my best to make you a good wife, said Liza. I think that the time has come for you to call me James. I am, after all, your fiancé, said James. Liza smiled at him, and her bright green eyes held his for a moment. It was then that James realised that Amelia had been right. He did have significant feelings for young Liza, and he knew that he would be very happy in her company. You have a son, don't you, James? Smiled Liza. I dare say that he is not too happy with the arrangement. How old is he? He's just 2 years older than you are, Liza, said James. Yes, I'm sure he will not be happy with this arrangement, said Liza. He will get used to it, said James, which confirmed to Liza that she was right. This is a very pretty garden, Liza. It's my brother's garden. I moved all the roses from my garden to his after he died. They have yet to flower this year, but I get a great deal of comfort sitting here. I should be sorry to leave it, said Liza. I didn't know that you had a brother, said James. He died just under 7 years ago, and I sometimes feel his presence whilst I'm sitting here. I will miss that feeling, said Liza. There is no reason why you can't make a garden for him at our home in Belfast, said James. And once again Liza looked at him and smiled. I would like that, James, said Liza. My garden is full of herbs. I have been learning all about their uses over the past years. And you can also have a herb garden. I told you that I would not stifle whatever you wish to do, said James. Will you be staying for tea with us today? Asked Liza. No, Liza, and I'm not sure that I will visit you again whilst I am currently in Liverpool. I'm not in your parents' good books at present, but I will call again well before our marriage. Thank you for being so charming and understanding, and I really do look forward to bringing you to Belfast. I know that eventually you will feel at home there, said James. He stood, bent down, and kissed her on the cheek, and then held her gaze for a short while before he made his way back to the house and bade farewell to Sheila, telling her to make whatever arrangements she thought necessary for the wedding. Liza missed her companion, Kate Templar, who had been dismissed when she had voiced her opinion that Liza was yet too young to marry, and certainly to a man 30 years her senior. Liza had very little idea of the intimate side of marriage, and her mother was not forthcoming on such matters. She knew that Kate would have told her what to expect, so she went into marriage totally innocent. But she was lucky, because James was very understanding and very caring, especially in that respect. She had no doubt that James was going to take care of her, but she was leaving everything that she had ever known, and friends such as Mrs. Walsh, Betty, and Mr. Ridgway, and it was a very daunting experience for her. On her wedding day she met Wendell and Amelia Fuller, and felt that they would become good friends. She was not so sure of James's son Frederick, as he frequently glowered at her, but every now and again she caught sight of James, and she could see that he seemed very happy. She said very little to her parents, and was pleased when she climbed into a carriage with James, and she never looked back. The next chapter in James's and Liza's life can be found in the first of the Liza Marchant series, entitled For All Time, which is now also available in audiobook.